Back in 1922, a group of scruffy, funny, and completely lovable kids took over Hollywood and changed comedy forever. Our gang, later known as the Little Rascals, looked like simple fun on the surface, just kids goofing around, getting into trouble, and making people laugh. But behind those smiling faces was a world full of shocking secrets, heartbreaking tragedies, and stories that nobody ever talked about. Some of these kids never got to grow up. Some were treated terribly. And the man behind it all had ideas that nobody in Hollywood had ever tried before. So today, let's pull back the curtain and look at 20 shocking facts about the Little Rascals that will completely change the way you see this classic show. Number 20. The whole thing started because of a bet. Before there was a single episode, before Spanky, before Alfalfa, yes, before any of it, the entire show started because of one man with a wild idea and something to prove. His name was Hal Roach, and in 1922, he was a Hollywood producer looking for his next big thing. One day, he was watching a group of neighborhood kids playing outside near a lumberyard. They were arguing, laughing, chasing each other, and just being completely normal kids. And something clicked in his brain. He thought, why do we spend so much money on fancy scripts and big actors when real kids being real kids is already the funniest thing in the world? He pitched the idea to his studio partners, and most of them thought he was out of his mind. Nobody had ever built a whole series around children before. It was considered too risky and too unpredictable, but Roach pushed forward anyway. And what he created became one of the longest running and most beloved comedy franchises in Hollywood history. Sometimes the craziest ideas turn out to be the greatest ones. Number 19. The kids were discovered in the most random ways. You might think that finding the cast for a show like this involved big Hollywood auditions with hundreds of kids lined up outside a studio. But that is not even close to how it worked. Hal Roach and his team found most of the kids just by wandering around neighborhoods and markets in Los Angeles. Some were spotted at grocery stores. Others were found playing in parks. A few were brought in by neighbors who thought their kid was funny. There were no fancy agents involved, no professional headshots, no acting classes. These were just regular kids from regular families who got plucked out of everyday life and dropped in front of a camera. And that is exactly what made them so special. Their reactions were genuine. Their expressions were real. They had no idea how to fake being a kid because they actually were kids. And that authenticity is what made audiences fall completely in love with them. Number 18. Ernie, Sunshine Sammy Morrison, was a trailblazer nobody talks about. Here is a fact that most people completely skip over. Before the gang became famous, one of the very first and most important members was a young black child actor named Ernie Morrison, nicknamed Sunshine Sammy. He was already a star in Hal Roach's earlier short films before our gang even existed, and he became one of the first African-American actors to ever sign a long-term contract with a Hollywood studio. That is a massive deal. This was 1920s America, a time when racial segregation was everywhere, and black performers were routinely excluded, mocked, or pushed into humiliating roles. But our gang did something different. Black and white kids played together on screen as genuine equals, as real friends who shared adventures, got into trouble together, and laughed together. For millions of viewers, it was the first time they had ever seen that kind of friendship represented in entertainment. Morrison's contribution to breaking those barriers deserves way more recognition than it gets. Number 17. The show ran for an unbelievable 22 years. Most TV shows today get canceled after a couple of seasons, if the ratings drop even a little. So try to wrap your head around this. Our gang ran continuously from 1922 all the way to 1944. That is 22 straight years of new content. During that time, the show went through silent films, then sound films, and kept evolving with the times. Hal Roach produced the series until 1938, and then MGM took it over and kept it going for another 6 years. Dozens of different kids rotated through the cast over those 2 decades because, of course, kids grow up. But the spirit of the show never changed. It was always about regular kids, big imaginations, and the kind of chaos that only happens when children are left to their own devices. 22 years. That is longer than most people stay at any job. Number 16. Though they shot up to 100 short films every single year. The pace at which they produced content back then was absolutely insane by today's standards. At the peak of the show's production, the crew was cranking out short films at a speed that modern Hollywood would find impossible. They were filming constantly, rotating between different stories, different sets, and different scenarios week after week. The kids showed up on set, were told the basic idea of the scene, and were expected to just perform. There were no long rehearsal periods. There were no weeks of preparation. The whole operation was built for speed and volume. Directors would often improvise entire scenes on the spot based on what the kids naturally did when the cameras were rolling. If a kid did something funny that was not in the plan, they kept it. That spontaneous, fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants approach to filmmaking created some of the most genuinely hilarious moments in early cinema history. Number 15. The child actors were paid almost nothing. Here is where things start getting uncomfortable. While Hal Roach and his studio were making enormous amounts of money off these kids, the children themselves were not getting rich. Most of the young actors were paid very small weekly salaries, and their families, many of whom were struggling financially, depended on even those tiny paychecks. There were almost no child labor protections in Hollywood in the 1920s and 1930s. Kids could work long hours on set without proper breaks, and nobody was watching out for their mental or physical well-being the way we would expect today. So parents sometimes signed contracts on behalf of their children without fully understanding what they were agreeing to. The studios held enormous power, and the families had very little. It was a system built to benefit the business, not the children who were making the whole thing work. Many of the kids who grew up on that show had very little money left from their time in Hollywood once it was all over. Number 14. Carl Alfalfa, Switzer, had one of the most tragic lives in Hollywood. If there is one story from the world of our gang that truly breaks your heart, it is the story of Carl Switzer, the kid who played the lovably terrible singer Alfalfa. On screen, Alfalfa was goofy and sweet and totally harmless. Off-screen, Carl Switzer had an incredibly difficult life after the camera stopped rolling. Once he aged out of the show, he struggled for years to find steady work as an actor. He drifted through different jobs, had serious financial problems, and fell into a life filled with conflict and trouble. In January of 1959, Carl Switzer was shot and killed during a violent argument over a $50 debt. He was only 31 years old. The details of that night were messy, disputed, and deeply sad. The man who shot him claimed self-defense, and no charges were filed. The kid who made millions of people laugh had his life end in a completely senseless tragedy, and it remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of child stardom. Number 13. Darla Hood became a star at just 3 years old. Darla Hood was one of the most beloved members of the entire gang, and her story starts at an almost unbelievably young age. She was discovered when she was barely 3 years old, spotted by a talent agent who heard her singing at a dance studio. Her voice was remarkable. Her presence on camera was magnetic. She joined the cast in 1935 and quickly became a fan favorite, bringing a sweetness and genuine charm to the group that perfectly balanced all the wild boy energy flying around her. Darla stayed with the show for years and remained one of its most recognizable faces. Sadly, her adult life was filled with health struggles, and she passed away in 1979 at just 52 years old from hepatitis. She never quite got the recognition she deserved as a grown-up performer, despite being one of the most talented kids ever to appear on that screen. Number 12. The show was secretly revolutionary in how it showed race. We touched on this with Sunshine Sammy, but the racial dynamics of our gang go even deeper and deserve their own spotlight. Throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and into the 1940s, America was a country where racial segregation was not just common, but legally enforced in many places. Black and white people used separate schools, separate water fountains, and sat in separate sections of movie theaters. Yet, on our gang, black and white children shared the same screen as friends without any commentary or explanation. They just existed together. That was radical. That was genuinely dangerous territory. Some Southern theaters actually refused to screen episodes of Our Gang because of it. The show received angry letters from viewers who were offended by the sight of children of different races playing together as equals. And the studio largely kept going anyway, which, given the era, was a significant choice. Number 11. Norman Chubby Chaney died at just 21 years old. Norman Chaney, who played a character known as Chubby, joined the gang in 1929 after winning a nationwide search to replace a departing cast member. He was a cheerful, lovable kid whose round face and big laugh made him an instant hit with audiences. But behind the scenes, Norman was dealing with serious health complications linked to a glandular disorder that affected his weight and overall well-being throughout his entire life. Despite multiple surgeries and medical treatments, his body continued to struggle. Norman Chaney passed away in 1936 at just 21 years old. He had barely lived past his teenage years. His death was a quiet tragedy that most fans of the show never heard about. Buried beneath the cheerful memories of the comedy he had helped to create, he deserved a much longer story than the one he got. Number 10. Spanky McFarland was one of the most naturally gifted child actors who ever lived. George Spanky. McFarland was just 2.5 years old when he first appeared on screen, and even at that ridiculous age, directors and producers knew immediately that this child was something completely different. Spanky had a natural instinct for comedy that most trained adult actors spend their entire careers trying to develop. He understood timing. He knew how to hold a reaction just long enough to make it funny. He could improvise. He could read a room. And he did all of this before he was old enough to read a real script. Spanky became the central figure of the gang for over a decade, which is an almost unheard of run for any child actor in any era. His ability to anchor a scene and make everything around him funnier simply by being present was a genuine, rare gift. He later said that some of his best performances happened when nobody told him what to do, and he just reacted naturally to whatever was going on around him. Number 9. The set was controlled chaos at all times. Imagine trying to direct a group of children ranging from toddlers to preteens, convincing them to hit their marks, say their lines, and not get distracted by absolutely everything around them. That was the daily reality for every director who ever worked on our gang. The sets were constantly erupting into total mayhem. Kids wandered off. Kids started crying for no reason. Kids got into actual fights with each other. Animals brought in for scenes would escape and run wild through the studio. Props broke. Costumes came apart. And through all of it, the cameras kept rolling because sometimes the realest, funniest moments happened right in the middle of the chaos. Directors learned very quickly that trying to force perfect behavior out of these kids was a losing battle. The better strategy was to set up a situation and just let it fall apart naturally, because the falling apart was always more entertaining than whatever the original plan had been. Number 8. Several cast members struggled deeply after leaving the show. The pattern with our gang alumni is one of the most sobering realities in entertainment history. Over and over again. The children who grew up on that show found that life after the cameras was brutally difficult. When you are famous at 5 years old, the world expects you to stay famous. But child actors grow up, their faces change, and the roles stop coming. Many of the Our Gang kids found it nearly impossible to build adult acting careers. Some struggled with money for their entire lives. Others dealt with addiction. Several fell into deep isolation and depression as they got older, unable to reconcile the gap between who they had been as beloved childhood stars and who they became as anonymous, struggling adults. It is a painful reminder of how the entertainment industry consumes young talent and often leaves very little behind for the people who gave everything to it. Number 7. MGM's takeover nearly destroyed everything that made the show great. When Hal Roach sold our gang to MGM in 1938, fans expected more of the same magic. What they got instead was something noticeably different, and not in a good way. MGM was a massive studio, built on glamour, polish, and control. They did not know what to do with a chaotic, spontaneous, deliberately rough around the edges kids show. Under MGM's management, the productions became more structured, more sanitized, and somehow less fun. The natural messiness that had made our gang so charming started getting smoothed away. Scripts became more rigid. Kids were directed more strictly. The wild, improvised energy that audiences had fallen in love with was gradually replaced by something more calculated and less alive. By the time MGM finally shut the series down in 1944, even the studio seemed to have lost interest in what it had purchased. Now, the final years of the show are widely considered the weakest, and many fans trace the decline directly to that 1938 change in ownership. Number 6. The show was colorized and re-released, decades later, sparking massive controversy. When the classic Our Gang shorts were brought back to television in the 1950s under the title The Little Rascals, they became hits all over again with a brand new generation of kids. But when the films were colorized in later decades, it stirred up a huge debate in film preservation circles. Critics argued that altering the original black and white footage was a form of destruction, changing the visual language of films that had been carefully crafted for a specific look. Purists were furious. Studios argued it made the content more appealing to modern audiences. The fight over colorization became one of the most heated debates in the history of classic film restoration, and Our Gang was right in the middle of it. The argument about who owns the visual legacy of classic films and who gets to change them is one that continues to this day. And the Little Rascals played a big role in starting that conversation. Number 5. A 1994 movie tried to bring them back and divided fans completely. In 1994, Universal Pictures released a full-length Little Rascals movie aimed at introducing the classic characters to a new generation of kids. The film featured a fresh cast of young actors playing Spanky, Alfalfa, Darla, and the rest of the gang. Some fans thought it was a sweet and entertaining tribute to the original. Others absolutely hated it, arguing that the movie was too shallow, too modern, and completely missed the raw charm of the originals. The 1994 film sits at a deeply divided place in pop culture memory. People who grew up watching it tend to have genuine nostalgia for it. People who grew up watching the original shorts tend to see it as a pale imitation. What is undeniable is that it introduced the characters to millions of kids who had never seen the classic shorts, which kept the legacy alive for at least one more generation. And that counts for something. Number 4. Buckwheat became one of the most recognized and controversial characters in TV history. William Thomas Jr., who played the character known as Buckwheat, became one of the most visually iconic figures to come out of the entire Our Gang series. The character was wildly popular with audiences during the show's original run. But as decades passed and cultural awareness grew, Buckwheat became a deeply controversial figure in conversations about race and representation in Hollywood. Critics argued that the character relied on racial stereotypes and visual caricature in ways that were harmful and degrading. Defenders pointed to the broader context of the show's integrated cast and argued that Buckwheat was simply part of the ensemble. The debate is complex, uncomfortable, and genuinely important. It forces a real conversation about how we look back at historical entertainment and how we reckon with the fact that something can be beloved and problematic at the same time. William Thomas himself was largely positive about his time on the show, but the cultural argument around his character has never fully settled. Number 3. A man falsely claimed to be Buckwheat on national television. In 1990, a man named Bill English went on a tabloid television program and claimed to be the adult version of Buckwheat, presenting himself as the grown-up William Thomas Jr. to audiences across the country. The story was picked up and spread widely. People believed it. There was enormous public sympathy for this man, who claimed to be a forgotten child star living a quiet and humble life. But it was completely made up. William Thomas Jr., the real Buckwheat, had actually passed away in 1980. The impersonation was one of the most bizarre and brazen hoaxes in television history, and it exposed just how easily the public could be fooled when nostalgia and sympathy were involved. The story eventually fell apart under scrutiny, but not before millions of people had accepted and emotionally connected to a total lie dressed up in childhood memories. Number 2. Many of the child actors lived in poverty as adults, despite making millions for the studio. This one is perhaps the most infuriating fact on the entire list. The Our Gang franchise made enormous amounts of money for Hal Roach Studios, and later for MGM. The films were sold, resold, licensed for television, and re-released in various forms for decades, generating revenue long after the original productions had wrapped. And yet, many of the children who appeared in those films and made all of that money possible spent their adult lives struggling financially. The contracts those families had signed gave the studios ownership of almost everything. There were no residual payments flowing back to former child actors when the films played on TV, no royalties, no ongoing compensation of any kind. Some cast members spent their later years working ordinary jobs, living very modestly, and watching studios continue to profit from footage they had appeared in as children. It is a story about power and exploitation that runs through the history of child acting in Hollywood, like a dark thread that never quite goes away. Number 1. The tragic deaths that haunt the legacy of our gang. Nothing quite captures the shadow that hangs over the history of the Little Rascals, like the sheer number of cast members who died young or under tragic circumstances. The list is genuinely heartbreaking when you see it all together. Carl Alfalfa Switzer, shot dead at 31. Norman Chubby Chaney, dead at 21 from health complications. Darla Hood, gone at 52. Matthew Stymie Beard, who struggled with heroin addiction for decades after leaving the show and spent years in and out of recovery before passing away at 61. J.R. Smith, who played a character called Mickey, died in poverty. Bobby Hutchins, who played Weezer, was killed in a military plane crash during World War II at just 22 years old. These were not just statistics. These were children who gave their best, most joyful years to a camera, and to audiences who loved them, and many of them got very little back in return. The Little Rascals made the world laugh for more than 2 decades, but the personal costs paid by the kids at the center of it all is a story that deserves to be remembered just as clearly as the laughter they left behind. Thanks for watching. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think our gang could ever be made the same way today? Or would some of the behind-the-scenes stories be too controversial for modern audiences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed these shocking facts, make sure to like the video, share it with a fellow movie fan, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible Hollywood stories. And don't leave just yet. Click the video on your screen right now to watch 15 insane facts you never knew about my cousin Vinny. Trust me, some of those stories are even crazier.